Time now for Harm Reduction, heard every Tuesday at 7 p.m. with Will Beaton, Cutting Edge Radio, where we'll ask the questions others don't want to ask. Now here's your host, Will Beaton.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Harm Reduction Report. This is Willard TeaBelly reporting live from the Sandbagger Newsroom, I guess. The Sandbagger Newsroom. Which, as you know, is in a basement in Colorado, which is a strange place for it to be these days. I'm still wrapping my own head around that. We have a fun show today, I think. Well, it's one that I've been thinking about for a while because it's one I need to do. Here at Sandbagger News, our motto is something to do with killing two birds with one stone. Is a good thing. Our specialty, one of the things that a sandbagger does best is kills multiple birds with a single stone, which is a silly metaphorical way of saying achieve more for the price of doing little. And in this case, I've found a fun way to connect my weekly duty as coming up with an episode and putting it on the radio with my other weekly duty of homework. You see, I am in grad school in Colorado for communication research. So we read lots of academic articles about how people know what other people think about media they see. So, studies where they survey a bunch of people and find out who likes which political candidate or who watches what TV show, or what have you. It's all got all this academic literature behind it and all these science papers and statistics and theories and quantitative and qualitative methods, and it's very interesting. It's so fun, and that's what I'm studying. I'm learning about all these ways to do things. And so for class this week, I was assigned a particular theory of communication research, and I need to lead a discussion in class on this topic. And so to prepare for this, I thought I would use this theory and pick a couple messages related to harm reduction and run them through this theory. Look at these harm reduction messages through the lens of this theory I've been assigned to learn about for class. And by walking through it and doing some examples with it on the radio here, I will be more prepared for my presentation when I give this. And I think it's a fun thing for us to do. In my personal life, it is definitely something I am learning to apply to the show now. I knew I was getting into this kind of research, but it's more so for some of my interests in other forms of science, not necessarily harm reduction stuff. Like my graduate project is probably going to include working with this wilderness nonprofit group, as opposed to, say, doing a communication research project on how harm reduction is studied or communicated. See, this is a big opportunity for me to do that, so maybe I honestly should be doing that, but I'm trying to squeeze it in where I can, and perhaps I'll end up doing some research into the communication of harm reduction in more graduate school after this program, but what have you, I'd like to start connecting the two. So I think it could become a fun exercise to me to check in with my homework every once in a while on the show here over the next few months while I'm a student, and relate what we're talking about to some of the theories or perspectives we're talking about in class. So today I'm going to try that for the first time here on the show. But first, I think it'd be fun to show two videos. First, I'll show one clip representing one point of view, another video representing a different point of view, nearly a polarized, completely different point of view in some regards. And then we will look at two theories. I'll save them to the end, but they got such funny names, you're going to love it, so stick around. But first, let's show a couple videos, one representing these points of view, so that when we use these theories and compare, we'll have some interesting insights to go on. the videos I'm going to show you, one is the trailer for Reefer Madness. So last week on the Harm Reduction Report, the UND Psychedelic Club they had a screening of the film Reefer Madness, which is published in 1936 in black and white. It's been colorized since. It was a propaganda movie paid for by, unfortunately, a Christian group, portraying marijuana as a very evil substance that instantly will hook anyone who tries it once and will turn them into murderers and maniacs and all sorts of really bold, unsupported claims. This is where a lot of the public first started hearing about marijuana, was from this movie in the 30s. So the UND Psychedelic Club screened this movie so we could talk about, watch it now with the lens of modern day life and compare what we think of it now. And so they talked about it last week on the show. You can find the episode on the Sandbagger News YouTube channel if you'd like to go back and review. But I'd like to play actually the trailer of the movie. And now this is something anyone can do because the movie Reefer Madness is now in the public domain. So I'm going to share with you the trailer, and then I'll share with you a different video, and we'll look at these theories. Thanks everybody for being here. Sandbag on.
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
Oofta. Wow. So, yeah, that's pretty extreme. Now, it's not fair to use this clip and say this is currently what all of the modern day people who are actually still against marijuana would say or sound like. Hopefully. I'm sure actually there are many people where that exact phrasing and level of excitement would be just what it takes to be a really believable and credible sort of thing in some people's eyes. I'm not sure. I would hope, obviously not as many as there were in 1936. But while we are innocently thinking here, as innocent as an innocent shoe, one may say, before it's too late, I wonder what conclusions we can draw from this very interesting tone, from a very interesting piece of communication. But first, let's play another video here. This is by the Drug Policy Alliance, a political, nonprofit fundraising sort of. They do drug policy stuff, and we've talked about them before on the show. And the only reason I'm stuttering over that, I think, is because I still sometimes struggle with their whole communicative tone. I don't necessarily understand why they choose to have the tone they do. Sometimes it comes across as non-ideal to me. But in this case, I have a video of theirs I really like, and the tone I think is really good. And it's narrated by Jay-Z, and it's got an amazing illustration that goes with it. So you should definitely watch this video, because there's this really awesome stop-motion painting that's being drawn while this whole thing is being narrated. But it sounds great just to listen to it as well. And we're going to listen to it now. It's about 3 minutes long, and a little bit longer than the other one. And so, yeah, I'm not trying to compare these two communicative pieces as representative of anybody in particular today. But let's look at them individually with these theories that I've been learning about in school, these about communication research theories. But first, here's the DPA video by Jay-Z called The History of the War on Drugs.
In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters. The sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the U.S. blew up. Today, we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the U.S. prison population, disproportionately locking away black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis, but there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated $50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared this so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
So, interesting. That was the DPA video about the history of the war on drugs. So I guess the second video, you can say, has a different political content, a different political ideology that it explains or critiques in either case. But there are certain ways we can quantify their attributes of these videos. There's tons of theory about this, and this is strange for me to learn about exactly how academic theory works, what it is, how it can relate to statistical and otherwise evaluative tools that include things like mathematics and logic that allow you to make confident claims with the right setup, the research design, and whatnot. And two theories, they're actually kind of weird cases. Either of them could sort of be defined more as a method than a theory, but it's a system of thought that kind of includes some theory and some methods. Two, in particular, that I am tasked in class with learning about are what I call, even though my professor told me not to call them this, the ant and the elm. The ANT and the ELM, to be more exact, or exactly actor network theory and the elaboration likelihood model. These are two really unrelated theoretical frameworks that researchers use in a lot of different fields, like, economics and business, and research of all kinds can use both of these models as it pertains to the communication researchers, the people who study how communication works and persuasion and why people buy what brand of this or that they do. These two concepts they're not really used together often. And so it's for that strange fact that I've decided to try to write a paper for this class. I have to write a paper. I'm going to try to write a paper about connecting these two things, seeing how they could go together if someone were wild and reckless enough to try to do so. Mainly, I think this paper will explain why so far people haven't used them sensibly, used them together, because there's no reason to, for many reasons probably that I'll get into. But maybe there will be one or two little reasons why it might be useful, and I'm going to try to do it too. I'm going to try to apply these things probably to this topic of wilderness. But what if we tried to apply these things right now to the topic of harm reduction, and specifically to these two different videos we just watched? Let's look at them through this theory and see maybe there's more similarities between them than we actually thought. Maybe there are many, many quantifiable differences, or maybe not really after all. And what are those differences anyway, the ones that seem like they're there? So I'm not sure if we'll get there, and also I'm not sure if I have a real thorough understanding of how these theories we're going to be talking about work. So this is mainly me doing my homework and brainstorming with you while we apply it to an interesting example that is mainly just to get us talking anyway. And don't take me too seriously when I'm describing these theories or anything. It's just a nice comprehensive way we might go through talking about these two videos in particular. So why don't we start with elaboration likelihood model? Or actually, if we don't quite get there, there's something else called the persuasion matrix. This is a list of what they call communication inputs and their outputs. And communication inputs are like things that went into the message itself, and communication outputs, that's like after the exposure to an audience, basically. What happens? What is the outcome of them receiving your message? And so it describes some attributes, inputs, of the communication itself. There are 5. These are pretty straightforward, I think. but they're worth just chatting about now. The first of the communication inputs is source. What is the source of a message? Well, in our examples, the first Reefer Madness trailer, it was a movie funded by a group. I don't know much about them, but the sources I've read just describe it as a fundamental Christian religious group funded this movie. I don't know who wrote it or anything. I'm sure there's a lot you can read about it. And I'd like to do more of that. It'd be really fun to do a whole paper just on that, actually. See, I think by the end of this episode, I may change my paper topic. Perhaps it should evaluate the communicative strategy of Reefer Madness, how it fit in at the time to the theory of how people thought we understood. At the time, to take a little side break from our matrix here, I'm learning there's this called the media effects trend. Well, actually, before that, it was called the mass society trend of theories that were coming out of the communication research world. Mass society. This was like, World War I. So 1936, this is coming sort of at the later end of this era. But this is when like TV was just becoming huge. World War I especially, they were experimenting with propaganda. And most of the theorists were sort of operating with the assumption that if the government made a huge movie about patriotism for World War I and everybody watches it, that it would have a huge effect on all these people and the society would be changed immediately and everybody would believe what they see. And mainly the researchers at the time were wary of this and were afraid of a world where the government or other elites, as they describe in the texts, could use one big budget movie to control the minds of people everywhere. As it turns out later, we realized that people don't become slaves to an idea once they see a movie from it, even back in the 20s and 30s and stuff. They really did hold on to their beliefs a lot harder than people first sort of thought in the beginning, for the most part. There's a lot of other factors that go into it aside from just you showing them the message. So it's funny that we're looking at 1936 with this Reefer Madness movie, because I'm seeing how it fits into this trend we learned about of that time period. So that's cool. So as far as source goes, communication input, source. The source of the Reefer Madness movie was a religious group who had a political ideology that they wanted this substance banned, and they wanted the image of anything associated with this substance they wanted to control that image, and they wanted to totally control the people who already had an interest in, for any reason, using or being a part of near that substance. Marijuana. The devil's plant with roots in HE double hockey sticks. As you hear, I had to edit that out in the trailer because of FCC rules, I'm afraid. I don't think I can say that on the radio, even in that silly context. Source. What is the source of the other video? Well, the Drug Policy Alliance, they are a non-profit group that is an advocacy group, and they support non-fundamentally conservative traditional stances on drug policy. They condemn those things, actually. And so they also, seek donations they use this tone, in my opinion, where they get people really afraid and riled up about what the bad conservatives are doing, and then it gets you excited to support them. But for the most part, they put out some really great videos aside from some of it's a classic fundraising tone problems that anybody on any side of any debate has. So I'm not surprised, even if it's coming from people that I'm trying to that otherwise I totally respect the stance of it. Sometimes the communication just sounds a little mean and exclusive, even though I don't think that's what they mean really at all. What do I know? That's all I know about the sources here. So those are two very different sources, but are they so different? Perhaps this religious nonprofit, I assume, group is comparable to the nonprofit advocacy group of DPA that produced the other video. They have completely different stances on the topic at hand, but perhaps they're funded in a similar way by their own supporters. And perhaps they are doing all they can to communicate what they think is right. And although objectively, Reefer Madness uses no objective science or anything at all, like data of any kind, to support its claims on how the drug works, about how marijuana actually affects people. Whereas the other video, the DPA video, even if it is having a political implication, it at least cites all its sources, and everything that the narrator said is a true statement. You know, there was no like broad emotional claims in there at all. Maybe you could think the tone was a little sassy at one point or another, but it's real subtle, isn't it? And we can respect that tone no matter what you think about marijuana policy or Reagan or whatever. For the most part, that's my opinion, I guess. But anyway, those are the sources, and maybe there's more similarities than we thought. Very interesting. Then, communication input, number 2, is message. The message itself. So, something can have certain qualities. The message can be emotional or logical. It can be long or short. Be organized or not. It can be directed at a specific or a general belief or audience, and so forth. Well, so trying to summarize the entire message and its qualities of both of these things is not easy to do, and I'm sure, well, what this textbook is telling me is there's many, many ways you can measure all of those qualities, and there's like tons of research about how to best measure those qualities. I love this. There's this term in research called jeez, I can't say it. Operationalization. No, operationalization. Jeez, I can't say it. Operationalization. No, that's not it. I think you see what I'm saying. Oh yeah, I said it. Operationalization. Operationalization. There we go. Bingo. I'm not gonna try to say it again. This is the concept where you make something real. If we're talking about measuring the sincerity of a certain message, well, how do you actually objectively measure something as abstract as sincerity? We can measure the amount of eyeballs it has. We can just count them. We can measure how tall the thing is. We can just measure it. But how do you measure a thing like sincerity? So somebody might say, well, in this case, let's call sincerity messages that include a certain mention to this or that, or that include a certain emotional aspect, or blah, blah, blah. I guess I don't have the actual operational definition of sincerity, the widely accepted uses of it in front of me, but that'd be an example of trying to operationalize, there we go, a concept like that. So, to briefly describe some qualities of the message input from each of the videos we watched, well, the Reefer Madness trailer, it was a trailer for a movie, so the trailer itself is supposed to be enticing to get you to want to watch this movie, and it was making some strong claims that you should take action in the real world outside the movie theater based on the content and information that is there. It almost presented itself as like a public service announcement brought to you by authorities. It definitely is taking a strong authoritative tone, in my opinion, compared with the message quality of the other one. So the other one was very artistic as well. It was a piece of art as well. It was this 4-minute music video, basically, which had all this art, which you couldn't see, unfortunately, and Jay-Z's narration. But yeah, I don't know. I'm taking away from the message column here of the communication inputs, basically, that these two videos you watch are pretty similar, more similar than I kind of thought they were, just when you have to describe them in one little phrase. The third input is recipient. So who is the audience here? Who is receiving your message? That would definitely have a big impact on the message itself. You're going to craft it in a certain way depending on who your intended audience is, recipient of your message. So are these audiences the same? I wonder. Who watched Reefer Madness? It seemed like it was definitely directed towards parents, but also just like adults of any kind, and I suppose young people too, because it shows young people's lives falling apart, and the video's trying to prevent that. So the recipient is sort of everyone, but at the time, this was like when these things were becoming illegal. This was, I think, probably directed towards policymakers as well. Compare that to who's the recipient of this DPA video. Well, I think anyone and everyone can benefit from learning about it, so it seems to me like the same people. Maybe the intended audience of both these videos, though in a vastly different time and in different channels. Okay, there's the next input. What's the channel? Well, at the time, the Reefer Madness was a movie theater, and that was a trailer that they would try to, they were getting people to go to the movie theater to watch this, whereas this Jay-Z video, you can just share it on Facebook or watch it on YouTube. Very easy. And a totally different experience watching it alone on YouTube, wherever you are, versus watching it in a movie theater, a packed house with people who are very excited about the content. Very interesting difference. So there's a different channel. And yes, the final communication input is context. In what context are these messages being sent through these channels to the recipients with the qualities they have from the sources they are from? And these are different contexts, aren't they? The difference is we know now so much more about the actual impact of marijuana on people and on society than we did in 1936. Is that not fair to say? And so the context is, from just one point, the knowledge is so much higher now. That's one thing. And perhaps that has influenced all the other inputs. But there's a similar context here of like a political imbalance, like on the brink of some big thing. In both situations, in both time periods, the groups who made the communication are responding to intense pressure they feel to influence the political process based on what they believe about these substances and what they think, how they should be regulated by the government. So similar and differences in the context there, in my opinion, and very interesting. So now why don't we switch over to the y-axis on this matrix and look at the long column of outputs. These are certain things, I'll read about them as we go through them and see how I think they make sense or what. But at the very least, these are just interesting qualities we can think of and then reflect on these two videos we just listened to, see how each of these concepts apply to our interpretation of what we saw. Outputs. What are some outputs? Well, there's one here called exposure. This is, in order for a person to be, this whole thing is about persuasion, right? So the point is you put these inputs in, the audience is exposed to this thing you've input into them, and then they change their attitude and then their behaviors. And whether you're trying to get them to change which brand of toilet paper they buy, that's a behavior, or get them to be more healthy and to exercise more, that's a behavior, or watch less TV. There's a lot of articles about that. Wowza. A lot. And it's probably a good idea to do so, by the way. The inputs are exposed to the audience who changes their attitudes and behavior. That's what we're trying to measure and figure out the interactions of with most of these theories, and with this one in particular. So the first thing you talk about is exposure. And in our case, how are people exposed to the message? Both the film of Reefer Madness and the 4-minute DPA video with Jay-Z talking about the war on drugs. Well, this is the first step to begin to measure if the audience is having a reaction to your communication, is find out how they're exposed. And so I think they're very different. The experience of attending a movie theater in that politically charged context of 1936, when this is suddenly all the rage, and even movie theaters are still pretty new and exciting. Everybody, I bet that was a wild experience to go see this movie in person. I bet they had big grand speeches and lots of emotional hullabaloo. Maybe not, but still, this would be a great research project to figure out the propaganda strategy of Reefer Madness, because they probably could have made a big impact. They probably did. Compare that with the experience of watching a YouTube video. You can do this under many different circumstances. I've watched YouTube videos by myself, when I'm totally alone, when I'm surrounded by other people, when I'm at home, when I'm with other people watching the video. I've watched a YouTube video in front of a whole classroom of people. One time from like a whole auditorium of 300 people, and I watched a YouTube video together. Many different circumstances, and there are plenty of research papers describing where and how and on what device you view something impacts your evaluation of it and its influence on your attitudes and behaviors. So that's very interesting, but I guess that's just a very different sort of exposure, in my opinion, watching a YouTube video, going to a movie. So they're different in that aspect. And one of the first outputs here, then after exposure, which in my mind is the initial most important thing, is attention. A person must attend to the information presented. So I love this sentence in the textbook here. I'll credit them. It's Jennings Bryan's and Mary Beth Oliver's book. The line here, just because a person is sitting in front of the television doesn't mean that he or she knows what is going on. I love that sentence, because they needed to say it to describe what they're talking about, but also it sounds ridiculous to say, doesn't it? Because who would assume that someone necessarily just sitting in front of the television does know anything about what is going on? I don't know, just kind of a funny sentence. I rarely laugh while I'm doing my homework and reading my textbook, but that one cracked me up and I wanted to share with you. But it makes sense. How do you measure if someone is actually paying attention? So there's a bunch of studies about that, and then all these tools about how to get somebody to pay attention if that's what you want, and also how to get people to not pay attention to the things you don't want them to pay attention to. There's plenty of studies about how to do that, and it's all very interesting. So as far as getting your attention, how are these things different? I don't know. I mean, Reefer Madness is definitely going for that urgent shock value, political health message vibe. And I think that was very different from the other one. The other one seemed to have a sense of urgency as well, based on what it was talking about. You know, it seemed serious, but like I wouldn't call the Jay-Z video lighthearted in any sense of the word. It was heavy, but the illustrations sort of make it not cartoonish is not the right word, but they somehow make it palatable. It's not so wild a concept, horrible a thing to consider when you're watching the animations, in my opinion. But how are they getting your attention? I don't know. It's with those artistic interpretations, with this journalistic, serious tone of rapper Jay-Z. It's an interesting way they get your attention. It's like quiet and right to the point and serious and not very emotional. Even like the most emotional Jay-Z got really is when he says, "Got it?" like halfway through. And I honestly think he's just making sure we're with him. But I don't know. So very different way they get your attention. But now there's papers and papers about different qualities that go into getting someone's attention. We could go all into it, but I'm just going over these different outputs in a very brief way to get us thinking about them. The next output is interest. This seems pretty similar, in my opinion, to attention, but let's see. To know if someone's interested, there are two phases of comprehension and acquisition. So, are the people actually understanding and learning from your message, or is it just going in one ear and out the other? They might be attending to it, but not understanding anything. So that's funny. How do you measure that? Are they actually remembering what you said? There's a funny study we read about where people went around and they were giving free coffee out to households who could remember the slogan to this fake coffee slogan they just invented. If we're going to tell you the slogan now, don't write it down, but if you remember it, when we come back, we'll give you free coffee. And almost nobody could do it. People forgot. But that was a first funny study going into looking more deeply in how people comprehend and learn from, acquire your messages. So I wonder how, it seems like the same way they got your attention in Reefer Madness, they're showing you these stories of people, children's lives falling apart, young people's lives being ruined, and young upstanding person in the trailer becomes like an axe murderer, and beautiful, talented young woman in the beginning like commits suicide, jumps out a window because she was smoking marijuana. Man. Very different ways they get you to remember these. Shock values, a lot of shock in the other one. I think the Jay-Z video is pretty shocking too, but it's also like not trying to be very shocking. It gives you these poetic images to look at, but they're not so shocking. They're things we already know, that there's tons of people in prison, for example. It's just a compelling way they do it. In the video, they cut out a bunch of little cardboard prisoners and put them in a huge pile, and it's just this big pile of cardboard prisoners, and they move around in the time lapse. It's really interesting. So there's some interesting visual components of both of these that probably go into people first catching their attention, becoming interested in it, comprehending the message, and acquisition. I think that's sort of like incorporating it into your prior knowledge. And well, then the next thing here is called yielding, and this is when a person actually accepts new information and changes some sort of understanding or belief they have. That's very interesting, and they say it involves memory and the storage of this new information, where it's going to be stored, and what attitude it's going to be changing. Interesting. There's how is the memory retrieved? There's got to be a decision to remember this and to retrieve it at some point, and it's very interesting. More of these outputs called action, reinforcement, and consolidation. To me, in my mind, it's like, what makes you think about it so much that there'd be action about this, and how does the idea get reinforced over time so that it's easier to be retrieved, and that it promotes or prevents, in whatever case may be, yielding of a certain attitude or behavior that you've acquired or comprehended from a piece of communication you found yourself attending to and interested in. To try to summarize all of those things in one ridiculous sentence there. Interesting. I guess we've hinted on the differences between these two videos we watched on each of these inputs and outputs a little bit. This whole matrix we've spent some time talking about now pushes us into finally the ELM, or what I'm not supposed to call the ELM, the ELM, the Elaboration Likelihood Model. It was so funny. You should have heard my professor. I said the ELM, and she says, "Don't call it that. You don't call it that. It doesn't make sense. Nobody would know what you mean." And I was like, oh. I had this whole pun I wanted to make about the ant and the elm, but yeah, it didn't work out. Well, here we are, the ELM. ELM. What it is is it's a predictive model. So it's sort of a theory of how the brain works when interpreting messages. It starts out with a message itself, a piece of persuasive communication. So in our case, the 2 videos we watched. And then the exposure to an audience. You sitting here, you're listening to the radio and you just heard them. That is the exposure you just had with those 2 videos. The first question the ELM asks is the audience motivated to process this information? Ultimately, the ELM says there are 2 ways a person can process information. When they are really thoroughly, critically thinking about something, thinking about it sincerely, thinking about it hard, that is called the central processing route. The alternative is called the peripheral processing route, in which somebody is not thinking critically deeply about something, but instead using what they call peripheral cues to make their sort of quick decisions. So, but the main difference between these is, are you thinking hard about it, or are you using images and stereotypes and your prior knowledge just to make quick decisions about what's going on? Central or peripheral processing. So interesting. So when a piece of communication is exposed to an audience, we first ask, was the audience motivated to process? There are certain factors that increase motivation to process information. The very biggest input there is personal relevance to the topic. So if you personally are very invested in the topic of drug policy for one reason or a completely opposite reason or another, you are going to be more motivated to elaborate on this. I should say, the word they use in place of to think critically, sincerely, and hard about something is elaborate, elaboration. If you do elaborate on it, you're on the central route. If you do not elaborate, but make quick judgments instead, you're on the peripheral route. So, if you find something personally relevant, you're definitely, and there's research that backs this up, like shows you are more motivated to process the information. So if the answer is yes, you're motivated, you move on one way. We're looking at sort of a flow chart here. First question, are you motivated to process? If yes, the next question is, do you have the ability to process? Things that could influence this are you distracted right now as you're being exposed to the message? Have you been exposed to this message so many times it's losing its meaning to you? Do you even know what the words on this message are referring to so that you actually understand what we're talking about? Like, is this in the right language for you to even, are you able to understand this? If the answer is yes again, then we're getting somewhere. But the first 2 questions are you motivated and do you have the ability to watch it? And I think whether you're in a movie theater or whether you're watching a YouTube video, I mean, you probably could be distracted in either situation, but you have the ability to watch that video undistracted at your own time pretty much either way. So I guess in our case, we just played them on the radio, so if you're interested in the show, you're motivated to listen to both of them. If you still had your radio turned on, then you had the ability to process it if you weren't distracted by the road, which, by the way, you should be paying more attention to than the radio, for sure. You're motivated. You have the ability to process. We are possibly thinking centrally about this. Now, if the answer is no to either of those questions, then it suggests that peripheral cues. Now we ask, maybe there's a peripheral process going on, but there's definitely no central processing going on. You can't elaborate on something if you're not motivated or if you're not able to process the information. So, we've been motivated, we've watched both those videos together here on the radio. Now we're moving on. What is the nature of the processing? It takes into account things like argument quality. Is this a really strong argument or is this a weak argument? That actually makes a big difference. If you've got your audience thinking critically, elaborating on the central root, you better hope you have a strong argument. Because if you don't, it could have the opposite effect that you wanted. So the next question is, once you know your audience is thinking critically, elaborating with you, did the audience in the end have more favorable thoughts or more unfavorable thoughts of this topic than before? Do they either like it more than they did before, or do they like it less? Basically, did their attitude change even a little bit? If the answer is no, then ultimately what your ELM model has brought you to is a realization that your audience, though they've been exposed to your communication, has retained their initial attitude, which is not what you want. Now, let's say they did have a reaction to it. Either people who watch these videos do have more favorable or unfavorable thoughts about any aspect of the topic than they did before. Then we ask one more question. Is there also a is there a change in cognitive structure? So there's the change on the amount of quality-related thoughts that have been had about the topic. We've just said, yes, there was either more or less of those. But is there also a change in cognitive structure, not simply the number of good feelings or bad feelings? What is cognitive structure? This is things like, they say, thought accessibility, thought confidence, etc. Did this really reinforce something you have, maybe? Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, certain cultural norm, that would change your confidence in having a certain thought, whether you knew it goes more or less with or against the grain of society, per se. Either way, like it's sort of like not just the content of your thoughts, but the way you think. If there's a change in that, I'm not sure. Why don't we think about this? A Reefer Madness trailer. I mean, I had more unfavorable thoughts about the propagandists of the world after watching such a video. Because when you see such ridiculous claims being made, it's just you get that appalled sort of feeling. And I'd rather not feel appalled when I think about the people who I need to work with in order to make change in drug policy. I'd rather think like more favorable things about them, even if whatever. But it's good that we all should be able to share that feeling of appalled, even if you are against certain drug policies that we've talked about on the show. I think you can still be appalled about Reefer Madness. Like, to some extent, you can be appalled. Even if in the end you still want to make marijuana illegal, you can still be allowed to feel appalled at Reefer Madness and be ashamed that it was a part of the forebears of a movement that you're a part of. In the same way, anyone should be like ashamed of straight up lying to people so strongly. So we've gotten all the way down here, whether there was a change in cognitive structure and a change in the number of favorable or unfavorable thoughts we've had. We have elaborated on this fully, and we either have made a positive or negative attitude change. So the ELM changes attitude. I don't know if anybody is changing their attitude after watching today the Reefer Madness trailer or the Jay-Z video. I think I changed my attitudes on the Jay-Z video after I watched it a couple times and fully processed it. And as I revisit Reefer Madness, I heard of Reefer Madness like 8 years ago probably, but I didn't understand what it was or what it meant then. Watching it now after I like became interested in all this stuff is really funny. And also pretty sad. So we've only got a couple minutes here. We're at the end of the ELM. We're not going to get to actor network theory. That might be next week. But end with a couple comments about peripheral attitude, peripheral cues. This is all just imagery and subtle things that go along with the main message. You don't have to think deeply elaborately about the images in order for them to have an impact on you. Somebody, an undergraduate in another class I was just snooping in on campus the other day, said, when they're talking about advertising in class, said that he was immune to advertising, that he never bought anything he ever saw an ad for. Ads didn't affect him. But the truth is, this young student, I'm sure, had never read all of this literature that we've just been reading in class, which very strongly, with overwhelming empirical evidence, says you are influenced by these messages one way or another, whether you are aware of it or not. If it's even in your peripheral vision, a McDonald's ad out the corner of your eye while you're driving to school, then you have been exposed to at least peripheral cues. And you're going to have to deal with that. And the first thing you should do is accept that it does have an impact on you, even if it's a real subtle one that you think you can control. You must admit that the impact is there, and you've got to have a sincere plan of addressing it. Whatever it is, if you're worried about ads brainwashing you, that's one thing. These peripheral cues, think about them when next time you watch a news story about, I don't know, peripheral cues we talked about in class were like during a newscast, or the subtle but not subtle at all things, like such as every anchor and reporter is like some stereotypically handsome individual who fits certain beauty standards and all of this like very strongly defined strict set of norms about how to speak and stand and be, and the professionalism that they define is very interesting by the way they is. Think about these peripheral cues along with the central messages. So next time the Herald or the DAZ, you go on there and it's a fancy-dancy anchor telling you that someone in your community has overdosed and died, and think about the tone there of the voice. Think about think about what you know he or she is expected to say and how they're expected to deliver this message, and see if they meet that expectation exactly. And then ask yourself, why did that happen, and is that really best? Does it add to their sense of credibility and sincerity? One wonderful point I'd like to leave us with as we wrap up on this episode is that research shows if you have to constantly justify yourself over and over again, you must be very insecure about something. So consider that when DAZ declares themselves the most trusted news source around 10 times a day, every day. Sandbag on, everybody.
You're listening to Harm Reduction with Will Beaton. Your comments are welcome at 877-347-0011.